Brain anatomy. Brain anatomy and physiology is covered in chapter 14. It's a fairly complicated subject, so we're going to break it up in several parts. So if you look at the study questions that are provided for you, they come in 3 parts: part 1, part 2, and part 3. So we're going to start with the brain anatomy, which is part 1. And here we go. So brain anatomy includes the brain and the cranial nerves. The brain is situated inside the skull, which is made of bone. So you can see this beige stuff around the brain with little dots in it. The dots is the porous, the spongy bone, and a little bit more solid part around the porous bone is the compact bone, the more solid bone. The bones protect the soft brain. The part of the skull that surrounds the brain is called the cranium. So this part of the skull is called the cranium. This is the skull, and to remind you, the skull is made out of the face or facial bones and the cranium out of the cranial bones. So the cranium is the part that encloses the brain itself. There is also liquid around the brain that is called cerebrospinal fluid, and it allows the brain to sort of like float inside the cranial cavity, that space inside, and protect it from the damage when we bounce around, for example, like when we jump or walk. So the brain actually has several layers of protection. The thickest layer of protection is the bone. Then there's going to be this white stuff. This is the membrane around the brain. It's called the meninges. And inside the meninges, between the brain and the meninges, right here in this space, this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is located. And the meninges actually enclose the brain and the spinal cord continuously, because technically the spinal cord is still the brain. And the space inside the enclosed by the meninges between the brain or the spinal cord and the meninges, this space right here, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is located. So it bathes the brain and the spinal cord and provides an additional layer of cushion. The space where the brain is located inside the bones, so kind of like between the bones and the meninges, still visible in this view, this is the cranial cavity. So if you took out the brain, there's going to be, of course, a lot more space inside of the cranium. This is a real view of the brain, actually. This is the view in the cadaver, and I apologize for the inability to see the entire slide. I can't change anything with the settings on this presentation, but you can open this presentation and follow along if you can't read the rest of the words. It's almost all of it you can see. Anyway, okay, so the brain is located inside the cranial cavity. You can see the brain is kind of like beige in color, some lighter areas, some darker areas. There's white matter, gray matter of the brain. We're going to study that later. And this is a picture that's showing the foramen magnum. A foramen magnum is right here. This is called the occipital bone of the skull. It joins with the temporal. This is the ear hole right here. So this is where the connection of the spinal cord and the brain happens, right where we can bend the neck in the back. Okay. Here's the ear hole. This is the jaw joint, TMJ, right in front of this is called the brain stem, the part of the brain that connects the brain to the spinal cord. So right here in orange marked the first part of the brain. The brain is basically the government of the body. That's kind of what its function is. It governs the body. It controls body activities, but it also is the mind producer in our body. So it produces our thoughts, our emotions, and our imagination and dreams. The size of the brain is basically the size of your cranium. There's not too much thickness to the cranium. The mass of the brain is about 3 pounds. It is made out of 85 billion neurons, and neurons are the special cells of the nervous system that create its functions. We're going to go over neurons shortly. There's also neuroglia. There's trillions, so more than neurons. There's neuroglia. Neuroglia are also special cells inside of the nervous system. They have different functions than neurons. For example, they don't produce our thoughts or dreams or control the actions in our bodies, but they do help neurons to live. They kind of like nourish neurons, they protect neurons. So they're not the neurons, they're separate cells that kind of like the helpers of the neurons. The neurons form synapses with each other. That means connections with each other. So there's about 1,000 synapses in the brain. So I'm going to start with a new video, review a little bit about the neurons and neuroglia and the synapses so that you can understand the rest of this presentation.